So welcome everybody. I would like to thanks a lot Ryan Haecker for organizing this here. First of all, because it's a very good opportunity for us to share our building and our enterprise, our work with you, but also for the topic, because angelology is a really important topic, almost forgotten in theology, in my opinion. In my reading, from two main reasons. First of all, for enlightenment and modernity and something like that, even if now post-modernity angels are really fashionable and so on. But also because I think it's a really tough topic, because you need everything. You need to know a lot about the Trinity, Christology, anthropology, everything. So it's really the top level of theology, and because of that also Aquinas was called the angelic doctor, because he knew a lot about theology. So I'm very happy that this topic comes back to the fore, and very thankful, grateful to Ryan for doing this here. And so thanks. And also just one, yesterday I was reading Clement of Alexandria, and he wrote that philosophy, the Greek philosophy, was revealed to Plato and so on by the angels. So there is a sort of angelic philosophy. This is a wonderful view, in my opinion, also a bridge between philosophy and theology. So thanks a lot, and you have the floor. And whatever you need, we are here for you.
Thank you very much, Giulio. It's an honor to be here, and I'm so very grateful for the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross and the Relational Ontologies Research Network for hosting this event today. Thank you all for coming. I'm tremendously honored and delighted to welcome all of you, both in person and online, to what I hope will be a most inspiring workshop, which I've titled Speculative Angelology. This workshop has been generously hosted with the support of the Relational Ontologies Research Network at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross, or Santa Croce, in Rome. As a fellow of the American Academy in Rome, I have invited all of you to participate in an afternoon workshop, which I hope we can explore the speculative or philosophical approaches to the study of the angels. Now, the title might be provocative in a way, and I hope that it could be also exciting. Typically, the angels have been studied in an empirical register, that is, by looking at the testimony of Scripture, defined doctrines, and even personal experience, a way of finding them. But in addition to what we have been shown in Scripture, we also have a rich history of speculation, that is, philosophical study about the idea of the angels and how those ideas are coherent and what they might mean and how they're related to other fields of inquiry. So the angels, from the Greek word angeloi, are godlike messengers of divine power within the world. Angelology names a theoretical science that studies the creation order and function of the angels. Since Plato, the study of the godlike daimones has been a part of the canon of Western philosophy. From Philo to Peter Lombard, the angels have been studied as the first created rational beings of intellectual or fiery light. Fiery controversies had once raged between the followers of Bonaventure, Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, surrounding questions concerning the individuation, communication, and location of the angels. And after Immanuel Kant's critical turn against metaphysics, we can still hear in the writings of Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, Martin Heidegger, and Raymond Maria Rilke a faint echo of the angelic in modern philosophy and poetry. Yet, as we are all aware, angels have more often today come to be regarded as a source of embarrassment for theologians and as a cause for ridicule by philosophers and scientists. And this, I think, is the great challenge we have to address today. Angelology has, since William of Ockham and Friedrich Schleiermacher, increasingly come to be regarded as a dubious antiquarian interest, which amounts to little more than an inventory of assorted records, testimony, and opinions from the theological past. It has increasingly come to be studied in an empirical register, and it has come to be curated as only the last living testament of theological systematic summaries of all that has hitherto been believed. The general cause of this loss of confidence in the study of the angels can arguably be traced to the beginning of secular modernity, rather whether it may be in the reception of Aristotle's Logica Nova, that is, the reception of the prior analytics and the demonstrative syllogism, or in the collapse of Platonic participation following Duns Scotus, William of Ockham, and the medieval novelists, or following the wars of religion and a shift of our culture to a kind of reductive empiricism which searches for truth in what can be correlated to observable evidence within the material world. The specific cause for denials of the angelic can, moreover, be traced to a gradual substitution that would later become complete in the works of Baroque Spinoza and Thomas Hobbes of the role of the angels as transcendent mediators between heaven and earth, with an immanent and internal self-mediation of the absolute substance of the whole material and observable universe. The vital philosophical question of the origin, nature, and purpose of the angels now appears to have lost all urgency, as these questions are more often deferred to be decided by the weight of empirical evidence. In awaiting such arbitration, we have suspended any judgment as to the truth of the angels and consigned their appearances to merely the witness of faith in a way that has prematurely arrested the advance of any continued study of the angels. At this moment of intellectual and cultural crisis, we share as theologians a profound responsibility to explore new ways to renew the philosophical study of the angels. For despite their now fashionable dereliction, the angels are not simply an optional addition to systematic theology. The existence of angels is abundantly witnessed in Scripture, is implied in the Nicene Creed, and was taught dogmatically at the Fourth Lateran Council. As Karl Barth has somewhat begrudgingly acknowledged in Church Dogmatics, angels, quote, belong to the theme of Christian faith, of which we are not at liberty to deny. And as the great Neo-Thomist philosopher Étienne Gilson writes, quote, to disregard the angels is to destroy the balance of the universe, end quote. And we can explore what that means very shortly. The strategy for this renewal is, I propose, that we should begin to pursue not only a way of defending the existence of the angels, but moreover, of exploring the essence of the angels, of what they mean, and studying them as a hermeneutic key to discover answers to some of the most intractable problems of modern philosophy. The basic argument for the existence of the angels can be held to follow upon the ontological argument for the existence of God. For if, as the ontological argument concludes, there must necessarily be an absolute idea of which nothing greater can be thought, and this idea is not only absolutely simple, but absolutely complex, then the complex multiplicity of the created world must be internally mediated by these more perfect spiritual intelligences. Hence, as early as Plato's Symposium, we hear of how the daimones stand as personifications of the ideas or paradigms midway between heaven and earth, ever, quote, interpreting and transporting human things to gods and divine things to men, end quote. We can observe in this argument the earliest beginning of a speculative approach to the study of the angels. In contrast to empirical approaches to angels, this speculative angelology calls for a renewed philosophical investigation into the angels as the key to answering many of the most intractable problems of modern philosophy. It can be called speculative as it attempts to see as in a mirror darkly, speculum enigmate, the angels as the angels can be envisioned to see themselves. As the first created spirits of a pure intellect and will, the angels can be held to collaborate in the creation of all observable entities, and as such can never become the subject of any positive regime of empirical observation. The evidence of the angels in Scripture is no more certain, as in each scriptural statement, the literal meaning of the text stands open to a plenitude of allegorical and higher spiritual interpretations. Speculative angelology can thus be considered the most richly philosophical, and for this reason the most divine mode of answering to the angelic. For it does not merely ask what we have heard of the angels as though they were literary artifacts from a bygone era, but more radically asks whether, what, and who are the angels as they may yet appear to us in our speculative but no less scientific imagination. In contrast to fashionable currents of modern philosophy such as speculative realism, which holds the correlation of the subject to the object to pivot upon a primordial real archifossil, and object-oriented ontology, which collapses the subject into a field of objects, speculative angelology should, I suggest, endeavor to sustain this interior reflection that is characteristic of Christian and humanist subjectivity by recalling the role of the angels in the creation of all objects that are directed in and for the subject, in and for our freedom. The way in which the angels are read in this spiritual hermeneutic of Scripture is equally that by which the angels reflect upon reading and instruct our intelligences in the reading and learning of the angels. The angelic hierarchy can thus correspond to, even as it is also creative of and constitutive, all that can be thought and thought to be, such that angelology is a corollary and a way of entering into the subject of ontology. With these brief remarks, I wish to welcome you all to share with us your own thoughts and suggestions concerning the present state of research on the study of the angels. This is an exploratory workshop, and I hope to learn from all of you about how you have thought about the subject, your research, and also what we might gain together as a way of thinking about and entering into this topic. We may begin to discover new avenues for the renewal of angelological speculation by asking these most original questions. We may come to know the angels as the angels directly know themselves, lit by the same divine light and guided in their freedom by this same speculative flight. To read the angels, we must turn our thoughts to heaven and look up Jacob's ladder. And with that, I wish to welcome you to the Speculative Angelology workshop, and I hope that we can begin by introducing ourselves. So I think it's probably easiest to introduce the people who have come here in person first, and then we'll move on to introductions from our guests online. And if you could please introduce who you are and maybe say a few words about your interest in angelology. And we'll have a moment afterwards in the forthcoming session to delve into these topics in more detail. If you could maybe perhaps flag 1 or 2 topics that you'd like us to talk about so that I can keep a list of them, and then I'll make sure to return back to these topics individually. And so to begin with, Philip, would you turn on your microphone and introduce yourself, please?
Hello, I'm Philip Porter. I'm a assistant professor of theology at St. Louis University's Madrid campus. I've been working on angelology since I wrote my dissertation on the theology of death, where I got interested in the question of how angels and the angelic fall might relate to non-human and human creaturely death. The topics I'm interested in are obviously those, but I'm also interested in the way that angels can help us to think about the questions of voluntarism versus intellectualism, specifically as related to the fall, and differing accounts of the creation of the angels, and to include the question of, say, angelic bodies, or the matter of angels, and how that might help us think about like universal hylomorphism. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ryan. Actually, I haven't devoted yet a lot of attention on angelology. I'm very interested in this idea that comes from Origin, that angels are everywhere. Everything is full of angels. So this the relationship between angels and the new idea of creation that we have from Christian revelation, and how this deals with a different concept of this mediation that the angels are doing, different from the Greek idea of mediation. Thank you.
So I'm Bobby Marsland. I'm in the 2nd year of the licentiate in dogmatic theology here at Santa Croce, writing my tesina on Maximus the Confessor. And before coming here, I was working in biophysics. And so one of my kind of areas of interest in this theme is the angels in philosophy of science, because we have this big transition that's taking place now from the kind of 18th, 19th century idea of just inert matter that's all the same and just has some laws that govern everything, to an idea of a more pluralistic order, where there are all these different realms of order at the microscopic, at the biological, at the ecosystem, that all are consistent with each other but not reducible to each other. And so now if you have this sort of pluriform order, there's lots of questions about how you justify the intelligibility of that order, how these things relate to each other, that I think relate to a lot of these questions about angelic governance. And the second area of interest for me is more on the lines of the philosophy of technology, which is also a kind of side interest of mine, because it's a common theme in a lot of commentators on the development of the technological society, that you have this reduction of human agency, that all the decisions that go into producing and using technology are more and more driven by apparently deterministic calculus. And so there are no actual human agents who are deciding things. And so there's an idea that, okay, if there's not human agents deciding things, you could also have other malicious spiritual agents that in the end are at work and taking advantage of this kind of abdication of responsibility on the part of human beings. And that's a little more out there, but that kind of language seems to be more and more common in sort of the discourse about the state of contemporary society. It would be interesting to see to what extent is this well-founded, to what extent is this just sort of rhetoric that is used by politicians or people who want to sell books, but I think there could be something there. So like those 2 areas are the things that are most of interest to me.
I work on Trinitarian theology, so my perspective, it comes mainly from pneumatology, because if we look at the history of dogma, the distinction between the spirit, capital S, and the spirit, small s, was something really tricky at the beginning. And working on this, my guess, I don't know if it will ever be possible to prove this, is that the angels understand better the procession of the Holy Spirit. On the contrary, for us is quite far because we are sons, we are children of God. So we are closer to the generation of the second divine person. And I don't know if it's possible to prove something like that, because we can talk to angels, but it's a grace, a special grace, and we cannot use it in theology. But I think that it's very interesting to see what we know also from the perspective of angels, of the two processions, intellect and will, because it makes our picture more complete, in my opinion. So it's Trinitarian. So we have the God, the human beings, and the angels. And we always should keep this openness of our theories to something that is beyond purely spiritual. And I work a lot on Gregory of Nyssa, and he thinks that the angels engender too, in some sense, that is not sexual, is not with another person, but by themselves, just as the Father engender. So there are a lot of big questions, very interesting questions, very creative questions that can be asked about the angels, and I like them a lot.
Among the members of the audience, you're welcome to come and speak to the Zoom chat and share your ideas as well if you'd like. If you don't, you're welcome to just observe the event today. But let us know, raise your hand perhaps if you'd like. Would you like to? Please do. Yes, we'll just come up. You'll have to turn on one of the microphones.
Be careful to give me a chance to talk. Yeah, I know. Okay, so I have 35 minutes. My name is Father Brian Humphrey. I'm a priest for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, California. I'm a doctoral student here at Santa Croce studying dogmatic theology. And my interests with angelology is with the question of the one and the many, because as far as I know, at least in the West, with Augustine and Thomas, they say that their angels are simple because they don't have bodies, they're not composite, yet their essence and existence separates them. So there still is a complexity that isn't, that makes them different from God, yet they are one, you know, in a way that composite bodily beings are not. So I'd like to explore the unity or oneness of the angel and its distinction from God, whose essence is his existence. That's sort of the technical question that I'm interested in, is the one and the many, but then also at a pastoral level. And my mission is to be teaching in a seminary in the near future. And so I just want to garner as many insights and learn as much as I can so that I can be able to discern what's appropriate to teach seminarians going in for pastoral ministry. Also being involved in deliverance ministry teams myself as a part of a prayer team. I have some experience sort of, on the ground level, if you will, in people's lives about that. So the pastoral approach to deliverance ministry and how evil spirits are distinct from, holy angels. Thank you.
My name is Paolo. I'm just started in this month the doctorate, the PhD here in Santa Croce, and it's the first time that I can participate in this seminary here with you. So this subject is so interesting also for me. I remember that when some years ago, more or less 13, 14 years ago, when I was a mission in Israel, a holy priest asked me, look, do you believe in the angels? Yes, sure. In the guardian angels? Yes, sure. Do you know the name of your guardian angels? I'm sorry, no. It's important to start with him, the new relationship. Okay, I'll try. But anyway, it's so important for me to listen that to hear this new relationship, collaboration between the angels and God. So it's possible to say anything else. Thank you.
Among the Zoom guests, if there's anyone who must urgently leave, who can't stay for more than 30 minutes, would you please raise your hand? If not, I will simply go alphabetically through the list and ask everyone to introduce themselves. Okay, if there's no one who must urgently leave, I think we might start with asking if Arabella Milbank, would you be so kind to introduce yourself?
Oh, hello and greetings to those meeting in person in the Eternal City and to those online. So my name's Arabella Milbank Robinson, and I'm a priest, an Anglican priest in the Church of England. I'm the Dean of Selwyn College in Cambridge. And by education and training, a literary scholar. So my interest in the angelic, which began, in fact, when I started studying some theology for ministry, is in angels in literature. And I've specifically worked on the role of angels in the theology of Thomas Traherne, where I was particularly intrigued by the way in which angels point us back to glory in our own embodied and material creation, and the paradoxes inherent in that angelic calling, despite their intellectual and relatively incorporeal being. But I'm sort of moving on from that study, and I've also written a little bit on angels in Rilke and Dante and other literary contexts, to begin to ask questions about the angelic in poetics and aesthetics more widely. How angels, you know, I'm interested in Ryan's perspective on not wanting to look at angels merely as literary artifacts, and as someone creedally orthodox writing on literature, that is obviously something that matters to me. So I'm intrigued to think about their role beyond the symbolic pointing to something or referring to something, that their role indeed in the whole possibility of meaning making, image making, and a meaningful poetics that indeed might point us towards, help us to participate in eternal truths. So that's kind of my broad area of interest. Thank you.
Marvelous. Thank you very much, Arabella. And continuing onward, I'd like to invite, I think Abraham has joined us. Abraham, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes.
Abraham, we can't hear you. Would you like to introduce yourself, or shall we go on to our next guest?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go on to the next guest then. Austin Freeman, would you introduce yourself?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Yeah, my name is Austin Freeman. I'm an assistant professor of apologetics at Houston Christian University. And I feel as if I'm copying Arabella's introduction. My approach to angelology actually also started literarily. I am a scholar of theology and literature as well. I focus not on Thomas Traherne, but on J.R.R. Tolkien and other 20th century British romantics. And so Tolkien's mode of almost unintentionally recovering the ancient Near Eastern divine council in his Valar and Maiar actually were very intriguing to me as a way of imaginatively recovering that sort of worldview and creating a plausibility structure for that again in modern audiences. It seems to resonate with people. I do have one article on angelic bodies and hyperspace, which I was pleased to hear we have one other person here interested in the question of angelic bodies. And then now I'm working on a longer term project that has to do, I'm trying to create a reader, a primary source reader in angelology and demonology, multi-volume reader that I've sort of just now undertaken in this past year. And try to help people filter out a lot of the nonsense that they can find online. The abundance of alleged information about angelology and demonology, the signal to noise ratio is quite bad. And so I'm trying to go back to the main strands of the great tradition from the patristics on into the 19th century, when I have to start paying for copyright, and sort of give the church's response to these doctrines, and not the New Age response that is actually much more easily located online. And that's why I'm here. I'm very eager to learn from the rest of you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Austin. I'm sure your reader that you're working on will be tremendously valuable, and I look forward to seeing it when it's in print. Our next guest, I think, is Harith. Would you be so kind to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, everybody. I hope you can see and hear me. My name's Harith. I'm a first-year Masters of Theological Studies student at Harvard Divinity School. I am approaching angelology from a background in literary studies, so literarily informed as well. And I'm interested in observing and learning because I am currently learning about the relation between literary studies and hermeneutics and the history of hermeneutics. And I think that angelology has a lot yet to contribute, hopefully, to these discussions that are happening, maybe in nominally non-theological registers as well. So thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to join you all.
Well, thank you for coming back and joining us, Harith. It's wonderful to see you again. Our next guest is Keegan. Would you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Keegan Delport. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. My interest in angelology is more come from a side angle. My focus, as of late, in light of a recent project I've taken up at the University of Pretoria, is the idea of bringing together the discourse regarding spiritual perception, regarding namely the discourse regarding the spiritual senses, which traces itself to Origin of Alexandria. Particularly our interfaces with what one could call experiential theology, particularly theology of the Trinity. But one of my kind of side interests of the past couple of years has also been in the ascetic writings of Evagrius of Ponticus. And Evagrius of Ponticus obviously has this this holistic system of integrating the domains of spiritual perception with ascetical practice. And so the way I kind of come into this subject or this topic is the integration between what Ryan has been calling, speculation and ascetical practice. So the way that the reformation of the self, the spiritual transformation of the self, is integrated with spiritual perception and the spiritual senses. So I'm interested in that connection. If we in terms of the theme scripture for this gathering is 1 Corinthians 13, the idea of seeing through a mirror darkly. That there's also this perception of this passage needs to be paired also with St. Paul's discussion in 2 Corinthians, where it also talks about the image of the mirror is brought together with being transformed, from glory to glory. So that there is this integration between speculation and, one can say, the spiritual moral transformation of the self, and how this then will connect to a spiritual perception generally, and particularly in relationship here, as in also the work of Evagrius, the perception of the logoi, the spiritual principles that underlie everything, and namely also how this connects to the angels' knowledge of the logoi themselves. So that's my kind of entrance into the topic.
Brilliant. There's so much there to explore. I hope we can very soon. And our next guest is, I'm not sure who this is, but LG is the name we have here on the guest list. Would you like to introduce yourself? Okay, this may be an anonymous viewer, so unless they say otherwise, we'll continue. Luke Togney is our next guest. Could you introduce yourself, Luke?
Sure. Thank you, Ryan. So I'm a research fellow for the Franciscan Institute at St. Bonaventure University, but I live in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where I also teach at Dalhousie University and St. Mary's University. And my focus on angelology has largely come through my work with Dionysius and Bonaventure. In terms of Dionysius, I have a great interest in his account of hierarchy, especially understanding it not as principally an ontological structure, but as let's say, a liturgical structure, a priesthood. And my studies also in my doctoral work also engaged with Second Temple literature. So I have a very strong interest in understanding angelic priesthood and angelic worship, both so that we might have a clear understanding of, for instance, what is angelic sacrifice, which actually very funnily came up when Ryan was giving his paper at PMR this year, and I thought I heard him say angelic sacrifice, and I got, ooh, excited. But here I am today. Right, because, there are many, several late ancient texts that talk about angelic sacrifice. So how does it help us understand what sacrifice is? And further, what do we understand of the church's inclusion of the angels? And for someone like Dionysius, the angels most definitely are part of the church, as are for many of our other patristic and medieval authors. So how do we think of angels in terms of their role in the church, their role in our worship? I've also done some work on looking at discussions of angelic worship in medieval liturgical commentaries. Aside from that, my other interest is in Franciscanism and Bonaventure's interest in the, let's call it the angeliformation of the soul, or the seraphization of the soul. And so looking also at Dionysius's reception in Bonaventure, how do we take the angels, indeed even the angels in their hierarchy, in their own internal relation, as a model for understanding what transformation happens in the divinized soul? Continuing to draw on Dionysius, I also have an interest in the role of angels in mediation, and looking at Dionysius's structure for explaining mediation. How do we understand the actual operation of mediation? Often we think of mediation as something which invokes difference. Rather, it seems that in Dionysius and his understanding of the angels, mediation is always a mode of mediated immediacy. So I think further study of the angels helps us think in that way, whether it's, let's say, in the context of ontology, what role do the angels have in the mediated operation of the world order, or in the, let's call it, ecclesiastical sacramental order. And just to throw one more thing on there, I heard a discussion of biophysics and some other approaches from science. I don't know if anybody's following the news, but in the US, the Senate tried to pass a UFO disclosure bill, which was massively gutted, but still something got through. And there's been an ever-increasing, since about 2017, when an important article came out through the New York Times, interest on non-human intelligence at the political and scientific level. And so I think the best place we have to engage with that from an ecclesiastical standpoint is, of course, the doctrine of the angels. So if there does seem to be some movement in that direction, how do we address the topic of non-human intelligence? Well, we have them already, the angels. Let's start. Okay, hopefully that does the trick.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for all of that, Luke. I'm sure we can follow up on some of those details. I've always imagined that UFOlogy was a kind of empirical angelology and something that is worth exploring for learning about the topic. And I hope we can talk about it later. Seamus O'Neill, would you be so kind to introduce yourself?
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Well, it's morning where I am. My name is Seamus O'Neill. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at the Memorial University of Newfoundland here in Newfoundland in Canada. Thank you. I really appreciate the invitation to come and be part of this today. I think it's a great idea, a great opportunity. I wish I could be there in person. It's been some time since I've been there, but it's nice to at least be here online. I've been thinking about and working on angels and demons for the past 10 years or so, a number of different areas. I've recently finished a book on Augustine's demonology that's now under review, which is meant to be kind of a comprehensive thing. So I'm interested in all sorts of areas: ontological, epistemological, questions of agency, spiritual warfare, and so on. In responding to some of the things that Dr. Haecker laid out, one of the things I'm kind of interested in now too, specifically, is this what Jacques Maritain and Bishop Sheen have called the sin or heresy of angelism. It's kind of applying what had been traditionally an understanding of angels to the human being. Since Descartes sort of separated the cogito from the body, the history of philosophy has spent a lot of time trying to get Humpty Dumpty back together again. And I think in terms of medieval angelology, certainly we have kind of resources there, ideas there that can kind of address how it is that a separated substance could think or relate to matter and these sorts of things that philosophy is having a difficult time with. So the question of the mind-body problem, as we say in philosophy, and what angelology has to say about that is one area of interest. I'm interested too in the idea of angels as separated substances, and what empirical science as an approach really could have to say on principle about such beings, given that it is kind of a very good approach to material realities, but immaterial realities, I wonder. I'm interested in certain literature, more recent on psychic phenomenon and so on, that's sort of questioning the variability of empirical science to say anything at all about these kinds of questions. And therefore how theology and philosophy becomes important, maybe necessary avenues for investigating those things. So there's that. One of the guests there in the room, Father, mentioned this question of ground level deliverance ministry. As someone who's been working with texts the last 10 years, I'm very interested in how some of these ideas and claims play out sort of on the ground with people who are engaged in empirically with the reality of angels and demons, and even accounts that I've read of that are still in texts. So I'm interested in how those sort of things relate to or pan out theologically, philosophically, with sort of the ground realities. I'm also interested in questions of the relation between angelology and demonology and the early Neoplatonic pagan traditions, and how henodology, this idea, as Luke had mentioned, about hierarchy and Dionysus being about sort of more power and role and not an ontological thing. I'm interested in those questions in pagan Neoplatonism as well. So maybe I'll leave it there. And just as a plug, I saw the name and saw the book, and I pulled this off the shelf. And Dr. Guthrie's going to speak, but I highly recommend this this book here. So thank you very much. I look forward to the rest of the
discussion. You're welcome to put a link for the book in the chat if you'd like to share it with the rest of us so we can find it for ourselves later.
Yeah, I highly recommend it.
Thank you. Madison, could you join us again and see if you can share a few thoughts and introduce yourself, please?
All right. Can I be heard all right? Is this better?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
Yep, you're good.
All right. Oh, sorry, I switched over to my phone. So I'm Madison Reddy Clifford. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Notre Dame, Australia. I actually am working on angelology directly in speculative theology in particular. My actual work begins with a sort of exaltation in the Nietzschean vein of the angels are dead, and we have killed them. What my project actually predominantly works on is this idea, is the required implication of an angel in the operation of knowledge within transcendental Thomism, which is the philosophy and theology associated with Karl Rahner, Joseph Marichal, and Pierre Rousselot, and the way in which, when you abstract the angel from the equation, you actually deform the theology and collapse the theology's interior logic. A lot of my work has been on trying to recover the significance of an angel, recover the way in which angels are required as an absolute predicate, as the mediators of immanent knowledge, which allows the operation of human cognition to function at all. And because it provides the impetus for the ordering of empirical sense data and why that matters. So in a sense, you could say I spend my entire day, every day, drowning in angels, going backwards and forwards on the necessity of the angel as being part of the basic function of our entire cosmological and empirical account of creation. So that's what I do.
Marvelous. Thank you so much, Madison. It's a great pleasure to have you here. And I believe now we've missed one of the speakers, so we'll go back to, if we could, Abraham. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Abraham Heraldez. I'm actually the secretary of the faculty of the Holy Cross. Sent me an email a few days ago, and I'm applying for a doctoral program at the university this year, and hopefully they will approve my proposal. In moral theology, but I'm interested with angelology, most especially in the relation to demonic possessions. What's their role? What they play in this aspect? But I still have to investigate about this aspect. Well, yeah. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be part of this program.
Well, splendid. Thank you very much for joining us, Abraham. I hope you'll find this a bit inspirational for yourself and your studies.
Thanks.
And our final guest is Shandon L. Guthrie. Would you kindly introduce yourself?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. First of all, thank you for putting this together, and hopefully I'm broadcasting okay. Please let me know if I'm not coming through. Okay, I got the thumbs up. Pretty good. All right. I couldn't help but resonate with Dr. Seamus O'Neill. Thank you for the plug there. I was thinking shameless plug, but it's a Seamus plug. So I appreciate for mention of my work there. Just to quickly introduce myself, I am an adjunct professor of philosophy at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And the focus of my work for the better part of the last decade has been to study the sort of the dark side of this question. So in a sense, I sort of feel like the black sheep in the room here. Not quite, there seems to be some intersectional interest here, but my focus has been on sort of the philosophical, theological approach to Christian demonology. And it was, I think it was insight that I stumbled upon with David Keck in his good work, fine work on medieval angelology, in which he sort of points out that we could learn a lot about, say, angelic metaphysics, ontology and such, by sort of studying demonology. And I thought about that, and I thought, yeah, that's kind of interesting, because when you think about it, angels are resourced by and deployed by God, and demons sort of, if demons are in fact former angels, then what we have in demonology is sort of angels gone wild. We have them unaided by the resources and powers of God. And so we might, interestingly enough, come across some interesting understanding about, you know, the metaphysics of these kinds of beings, these intermediary beings, by sort of focusing on the bad guys here. And so my doctoral dissertation was on a model I was trying to chase up, you know, reading patristics and medieval scholars, mostly from the philosophical bent, and trying to make a lot of sense of this, because there seems to be a lot of tension in the writings. I heard one fellow was doing work on Augustine's demonology, which that was a difficult read, trying to parse that out together. And so I appreciate the work being done there, and just reading a lot of, you know, sort of the philosophical input. What I tried to do is I tried to formulate a model that took seriously sort of the biblical description of these kinds of beings being spiritual realities. And so I chased that up through the lens of studying demonology in that regard. And then I think there's a lot of impact areas, some of which I've written about. One more recently, I heard Seamus also mention he's interested in working in spiritual warfare. I actually just did a book that came out last year called The Conqueror's Tread, in which I do talk about, you know, how philosophy can speak into the issue of spiritual warfare, vis-a-vis appreciating sort of the nature and the nuances of Satanology and demonology. And I'm interested in a lot of the impact areas of this research. I think it also affects how we might understand discussions about the problem of evil in philosophy of religion. I think it also has input into the question of mind-body dualism, questions about that. As I mentioned, areas of practical theology like spiritual warfare and such, and, you know, special problems. Another, I think it was Luke that had mentioned ufology. I'm actually looking into that now. I know that there have been some I don't want to say popularizers, because I don't want to demean their scholarly input, but the late Dr. Michael Heiser, I know, has made quite an impact in this area, and a lot of conversations about ufology, paranormal activity and such, is, you know, raising interesting, potentially, you know, empirical content dealing with this subject, something that we can explore and perceive either through the lens of our theology or angelology and such. So I'm interested to see what pathway comes out of today. I'm very much interested in all the input of everyone here. And yeah, so I, again, just by way of summary, my approach is to sort of take a look at demonology to see if that can help inform our angelology.
Thank you very much, Sandon. That was marvelous, and I'm sure we'll get back to talking about UFOs and UFOlogy very shortly. But before we turn to that, Samuel has just joined us, and I hope all will be well, and you'll find great success, Samuel, with your endeavors. And would you please introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, and my apologies to all for being late. Ryan, thanks for organizing this. I don't know many or perhaps any of you besides Ryan, and I look forward to discussing further and getting to know you some. I'm a research and teaching fellow at the University of Münster in Germany in what we call the Exzellenz Cluster for Religion und Politik. And I stumbled across my interest in angelology by accident. It was really through my doctoral dissertation on Chrysostom and the exegesis of Genesis in the early church that kind of started it. I found that early church understandings of the Tower of Babel were often linked to Jewish traditions regarding the angels of the nations. And this was a weird topic, weird idea to me at the time, and so I chased it down and discovered that it was a considerable topic. And not only in the early church, but really in every era, every major theologian that I've looked across so far has engaged it to some extent, some at great length, others just in passing reference. And it's the idea, Oscar Kuhlmann in his Christ in Time book calls it summarizes it as the idea that each people or every nation is governed by an angel. And so this idea fascinated me for its political implications, looking at it in Gnosticism, and there's as Dr. Guthrie was just explaining in terms of the fall of the angels and the more demonic side, certainly has a strong presence with this tradition. And so I'm tracing it. I'm trying to see if it's possible to write a whole history of the thing. We'll see how that goes. It's a bit much, too many periods to cover perhaps. But really the most interesting periods of development for the theme are in the 4th century, 3rd and 4th century, in the 20th century. And so I'm using political theology to address this. Agamben takes it up. Erik Peterson is really the center of my work. Peterson is one of the only scholars who surveyed the theme in an article that isn't well known. And so I'm spinning my interest in Peterson together with this and developing a translation of a new translation of some of Peterson's texts. I hope that will be coming out soon. So these are kind of my two interests, broadly speaking. I don't know how much depth you want us to go into here, Ryan.
That's wonderful, Samuel. Thank you. I hope we'll have a chance to follow this up, and I think we certainly should talk about the political aspect of angelology very soon. I think we have one more guest who's recently joined. Christina, would you like to introduce yourself? Oh, well,
hello.
Oh, there you are. Welcome.
Hi, thank you very much. I missed the earlier introduction, but my name is Christina. I am actually an undergrad student, and I am interested in the topic of angelology.
Well, brilliant. Thank you very much for joining us. At this moment, unless there's any urgent business, I'd like to open up the floor for our group conversation about the topic of the angels. And in my introduction, I alluded to the great difficulty, the almost impossible incredulity that we face when we attempt to talk about the angels in a public setting, and especially with our more secular or scientific colleagues. And I take it that there's a number of very well submerged cultural trends that have caused this difficulty, that have erected this barrier that makes it challenge to speak about what our theories could mean and whether they could be true, and how they could be taken to be true by a broader public who's often incredulous, not just about truth itself, but also about immaterial things or things that are super sensible. And what I want to ask is, what do we think is the cultural cause of this? Where does this come from? We might say that there's a genealogical cause of this, as I've illustrated with the beginning of secular modernity in a very general sense, whether it be with the introduction of Aristotelian science, or whether it be medieval nominalism, or whether it be an Enlightenment sense that we have to find a sort of neutral ground that doesn't appeal to revelation, for which the angel should be subtracted. And has that metastasized today? Or is it the case that in the late 19th, early 20th century, perhaps even more in what people call postmodernity, that there's new openings for thinking creatively about what could be in a way that isn't captured by any definite vision of the world? And has the world become more porous, more open to a kind of clerestory of angelic appearances that have manifested variously in poetry and literature, and openings in even in non-Christian or atheistic philosophy? We mentioned, for instance, Giorgio Agamben and many others that we could consider here. So I would like to ask you, what do you think have been the causes of the decline of angelology, and are there new avenues for thinking about the angels today, and what might those be?
Well, I can start, I suppose. I think yes. On the apologetics side of things, I'm professionally obligated to keep abreast of how people respond to Christian ideas, and I see the plausibility of this is increasing, and the interest among people is increasing. I mean, it's sort of flabbergasting in a lot of ways. I saw on Facebook the other day, it's not normally a scholarly resource, but I suppose it's a phenomenological resource. Someone said about the exorcism of well, the basis of the movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose. I forget the girl's name, Annalise something. So this poor girl, they performed an exorcism on her. She didn't need anything like that. She needed a shaman. And to me, that struck me as illustrative that there's so much, on the one hand, people dismissing as ridiculous these traditional Christian beliefs, and then embracing wholeheartedly these new beliefs, which are more or less equivalent, shamanism and spirit guides and all these other things. So it might be that we're looking at the same concepts clothed in different vocabulary. Even within that, the Christian approach to angels and demons, I see is people are becoming increasingly interested in that, in terms of my students and other faculty members, as we see a shift in biblical studies towards recovering the ancient Near Eastern worldviews of divine counsel, or the B'nai Elohim, or all of these things. I mean, I can remember within my lifetime, it was sort of the minority view that the sons of God in Genesis were human beings, and now it seems like everyone accepts that they are some sort of supernatural, angelic, demonic entity. So yeah, there's certainly a shift being made on my end, or from my context.
Bobby, did you have something you wanted to contribute?
There we go. Yeah, just a quick observation, kind of along those lines of how modernity leads to this difficulty in taking angels seriously as a pretty fundamental part of the disenchantment of nature, as Weber talks about. Because big part of what it means for the world to be disenchanted is that there are no other agents other than us. And so the only agents are human beings with our scientific and technological mastery, and that's the way that problems get resolved. But there can be no appeal or fear of other kinds of agents. And now we're in a period where that position is becoming less and less plausible. And there's this attempt to re-enchant nature, this awareness that whole take on the world actually is not justified. But it's been so long since we've thought about things outside the sort of technical empirical sphere that we don't really have a good sense of how to do it in a disciplined way. And I think that can create another obstacle where people realize, okay, yeah, clearly the whole disenchanted, reductive view is wrong, But I'm afraid that if I start thinking about these other things, I'm just going to go and think about something crazy because I don't have the kind of control that I'm used to in doing empirical research, where at least you can see immediately, have feedback if everything is wrong or not. And so I think that makes people, especially in academic circles, very hesitant of going there because it feels like I don't have anything to lean on to make sure that I'm not just going into some sort of fantasy world.
Absolutely, yes. I take it that we're open to recognize agency from many different quarters now, from substratal quarters, from celestial places, but we don't often have a way of framing how we relate to those agencies in the way that systematic theology had provided, and perhaps that's just what we need to recover. Oh, Luke, would you like to speak? And for everyone else, would you please raise your hand online if you'd like to join the conversation? Thank you.
Sure, Ryan. One of the things that I noticed when I started digging into the question of medieval liturgical commentaries and their approach to angels was that there was a sort of I guess you'd say, a gradual retreat from the idea that angels are also involved in offering sacrifice. I think it's once you get into the 13th century, there's a sort of concern to eliminate this message or this notion. I think it was is it John Beleth maybe is the last. Anyway, there's a point at which you go from like Honorius Augustinensis, and then poof, you see his language being absorbed in his discussion, let's say, of the preface dialogue, for instance, in some of these other places, or the Suscipe, the prayer from the canon, which has the angel bringing the sacrifice to the altar on high and all that kind of stuff, where it stops being interpreted that way. And so I think one of the reasons why we perhaps have seen a retreat from angelology is they've sort of been pushed farther and farther away from, let's say, our ecclesiastical locations. The angels are generally thought of as being saved by Christ, whereas, you know, certainly they have to be in many earlier patristic thinkers, even if in a different way than us. And so pushing them out of our sphere of being involved in the liturgy, of being saved with us, etc., I think has sort of pushed them into a sphere where they were easy to lose. So I don't think it's just reductive materialism. I think in some ways our ecclesiastical conception of what an angel is and what angels do has contributed.
Certainly, it's often been observed, and Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite in the ecclesiastical hierarchy already points to this, how the angelic mediacy in the liturgy is the key point at which humans have access epistemically and ritually to connecting with the angels and celebrating them. And as soon as that's pushed up to the margins, I think we often are at a loss to understand or recognize what the angels could mean for us and why they matter.
Yeah, but it's sort of the first point of contact.
Yes. Yeah, so in a way, it's not as it were the world or the secular society, but perhaps even Christian culture that has been at a loss to understand and appreciate the angels. Madison, I think you had your hand up first.
So sort of building on that, one of the things that strikes me is, having done extensive work translating Mareschal, translating Rana, is the way in which our pedagogies in theology itself, with the advent of systematic theology, the move from systematics, from dogmatics, and from the previous distinctions, led to a kind of atomization within the integrated character of theology, and angelology simply got pushed further and further away until it no longer was relevant to the core of the discipline. So it strikes me almost as if part of the problem really is how do we reintegrate our thinking? How do we move against what Rana calls an easiological concupiscence, the sort of fragmenting of our theories of knowledge themselves, where our knowledge itself, in its racing to accomplish and account for various phenomena in the 20th century, has lost that call to unity. It's actually lost sight of the transcendental. It almost seems as if to be someone seeking knowledge now is to run away from unity rather than run towards it. So I'm just wondering if it's really helpful so much to be thinking in the genealogies of where this sort of idea sets in, rather than looking at the practical sense, because it does seem as if that last century of ours, that 20th century, that long, horrible 20th century, has led to a further fragmentation. And an encouragement in this level of specialization and uniqueness in our thinking that has actually in many ways become quite problematic for the unity of our thinking, and whether or not that we need to be always looking at how we're going to unify such themes back into the core, how we're going to bring these things back into things rather than simply trying to establish them individually on their own.
Very interesting. So perhaps a bad systematic theology has been responsible for categorizing the angels in a way that's only accidentally related to the core of Christian theology, in a way that seems dispensable. Samuel, you had your hand up. Oh, Madison, did you have anything to say?
I was just going to sort of touch on that. I think more than that, I think the systematization in philosophy has also not helped.
Yes.
It's all over our disciplines, really.
Yes. Samuel, you had your hand up next.
Madison's comments are interesting, I think. I wonder if part of the rift that we need to overcome is a distinction between not just within the discipline and how the discipline is conducted, but within, in terms of wider epistemology, in terms of the world and the political. In the scholastic Middle Ages, they encountered the problem of the rotation of the heavens, newly discovered and accessible to them in fresh ways, with the notion of an angelic hierarchy, which was prior to this discovery associated with angels as motors. Basically, angels are these well, there's the angels of the winds and the angels of the different planets and the stars, and so there are these motor functions that make our world go round. And perhaps what hasn't been healed is a conception of angelic hierarchy that is more compatible with what science is teaching and showing and suggesting. And so I wonder if there's something within that, because I've always viewed that as leading to a fundamental rift between the possibility of sovereignty and the world itself. In other words, the world doesn't reflect the hierarchy that we see in the constructions of pre-scholastic organizations of angelology.
Yeah, so once we have a scientific picture of the world that has no need, whether it be of God or angels, then they seem to be something that can be subtracted and should be subtracted. That is, and perhaps it has something to do with either the jettisoning of the angels from a constitutive role within the material universe, or also a conflicted notion of the angel movers that are at work in physical motion. I was reminded of a perhaps apocryphal quote from Pierre-Simon Laplace when Napoleon asked him where God fit in his mathematical universe. He said, "There is no need for that hypothesis." And we might say something similar happened with the angels, that at a certain point in perhaps late scholasticism or early modern physics, that no longer did we need, it seemed, the angels as movers of the celestial bodies. But perhaps we might have a new way of thinking about that today, whether it be in vitalism or whether it be in something like the homeostatic apparent agency of stars and planets, the Gaia hypothesis. On that pregnant note, let's move to Seamus O'Neill.
Thank you. Yeah, Ryan, I was thinking the exact same thing you just mentioned. I guess one of the things that comes to mind immediately is the idea of at least a claim that empirical science is a standard of kind of proof or reality. And there's nothing I find a philosopher that I come around loves more than when some scientific study backs up something they're saying philosophically, which is why I kind of like the addition of speculative here on the title of the workshop. There are a few things I guess I could say, three kind of points, is that if empirical science, if what we say about the angels in certain sense in typical Christian philosophy, I mean, there's been no pronouncement that the angels are disembodied, but as a book I was reading recently said, it's advisable not to go against that view. But if they are, then empirical science really has nothing to say about it. So if you're kind of thinking that empirical science is a standard for what's real or worth thinking about, and if empirical science can't say anything about an immaterial entity, then it seems kind of pointless from the start. And I think with an idea of a scientific reductionism, the angels don't really have as much to do anymore. A lot of the great things that people have been saying so far about the angelic role in creation and sustaining and the ordering of the cosmos, if they don't really have a role, if one thinks that science can account for all the things that are to be accounted for. We don't have it's like the opposite of Aquinas's principle of plurality, right? The principle of plenitude, where we should expect all kinds of various interesting things in a world created by an omnipotent God, not a kind of reduction to what's the minimal amount of stuff necessary to get the whole thing going, which kind of seems to be at least a claim to how we approach things now. So whether the angels have things to do, and we kind of made ourselves the angels, I think, in place of that too in our approach, right? The angels don't have a role, and we kind of become them ourselves. I also think hierarchy is kind of politically out. The whole conception of hierarchy and thrones and dominions and this kind of regal lens through which a lot of the language is kind of put is kind of politically out, right? People don't like hierarchy so much anymore. Everything's kind of leveled out, right? So I wonder, is that maybe sort of politically a non-starter for someone who would be approached with this idea of a stratified hierarchy of realities from God to an ant? But there is an opening. I think I agree that, the opposite of religion is never atheism. The opposite of religion is superstition. So there's always going to be some open. You mentioned shamanism or wherever, where people, I think, are have a feeling for these kinds of ideas and an opening. And I find in teaching now, teaching a Christian thought in a philosophy class a decade ago, the response for intro students would always be sort of in a secular university where I am, it's always a resistance to anything religious. Whereas now there's no response to anything religious. It's like students now coming in don't know what they're supposed to be even against anymore. So I think there is a kind of opening now where they kind of approach ideas with at least students now about these kinds of opportunities or realities that are out there, because there's because of, I think, a decline of a practice of religion, certainly in Canada or North America, we could say there's less of an understanding, but also less of a resistance to that. So there's a few things that come to mind in relation to that question.
That perhaps is a very hopeful opening if, as it were, the terminus of secularity is to dissolve all understanding of its opposite, then the end of the secular is the post-secular, and the post-secular opens up to a kind of possibility of reviving a Christian culture, or a culture that's open perhaps to the idea of the angels. Now, we have some people from the audience who'd like to speak. Father, Brian, would you come up?
Yeah, sorry. Thank you for your contributions, everyone. Within the scientific reductionism that I hear Seamus and others talking about, perhaps to be more specific, I think that the loss of interest in angelology comes from just the rise and triumph of psychology, in particular, through biblical interpretations being psychologized, all the evil spirits in scripture. Oh, that's just a psychological disorder. I mean, there have been generations in seminaries where priests have been taught that evil spirits are just psychological disorders. So I think, likewise, the response is through the psychological language. I found it effective to talk about the 3 levels of oppression with, in deliverance ministry, with oppression, obsession, and possession. And when you talk to people about obsession, everyone can relate to that. If you talk to people about how certain thoughts are trying to control you, and you have to say no to those thoughts, everybody can relate. So if you start to get into the psychological language, I think that that's an entryway into some of the more academic areas. So yeah, the psychological as the cause and the psychological as the response.
This is also one of the areas I think of quite a lot of overlap with Evagrius of Ponticus's writings and work, where there are fine-grained distinctions about the movements of the mind, and he's often relatively agnostic about the source of the movement. Right? He knows that the possible tempting thoughts, the logismoi, come from the world, the flesh, and the devil, but quite often it's not possible to discriminate between the sources. And so from his perspective, the response ends up being quite similar in either case. So you find this in his the Anti-Reticos. The response ends up being this hurling back of darts of scripture back at the tempting thought. But he's giving these obviously very astute observations about the working of the human mind. And I think one of the ways I often teach the Anti-Reticos because my undergraduate students find his not determining at the outset, yes, this is a demon, yes, this is a tempting thought, oh, this is a temptation that comes from outside of your from the world is helpful for them because they can still place it within a relatively secularized notion of psychology. So it's interesting that you found that also in ministry, that's accessible. I found that that for undergraduates without a sense of the spiritual, Evagrius can be a nice way in. He kind of anticipates a lot of the movements in cognitive behavioral therapy as well. So.
Marvelous. Austin, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I actually had a question about that. So I remember a passage in Evagrius somewhere, I don't remember where it is, where he talks about demons pressing on the parts of people's brains and making them see things or feel things. And that struck me when I read it, because of course at that time in their medical knowledge, they didn't even know what the brain did. And yet Evagrius is here talking in almost modern neuroscientific terms about brain perception interactions, but he's ascribing it to demons. And so he's almost talking as if they're not mutually exclusive, they're neuroscientific and the demonological. And I wonder if you had a response to that, or if you could help me relocate that quote.
I can't help you relocate it right off the top of my head, but I know there was someone else who's been working on Evagrius in our group. I do recall what you're saying, though, the idea that, and this is always a touchy subject in demonology, especially, is how precisely do the demons manipulate our thoughts? But one of the ways does seem to be through these physical processes, right? Because this is you find this in Evagrius, you find it in Augustine and Thomas, that the angels have a sort of presidential role or an administrative role in creation, and so are interacting with or governing physical processes. That angels have this faculty. And so too, then do the demons, right? That they're able to misuse. But I think you're right. Perhaps one of the other audience members will, be able to locate the precise citation. But I do know what you're talking about, and it is one of those ways that he thinks that that demons can present sort of phantasmata to the person who's being tempted.
Keegan.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure the exact reference, but as part of Evagrius's overall kind of, you can say spiritual, you can say practice or kind of system, he has this kind of division of the rational part, the concupiscible part, and the irascible part, and so I'm not exactly sure if that's kind of a lingering in the mind, but these are different aspects of the self which are open to spiritual influence, and through the transformation, through the ascetical transformation, the irascible part of the soul, the concupiscible part of the soul can also be transformed, as well. And so I'm not sure if that kind of clarifies things, but I think the one reference, I mean, you find it in several parts of his corpus, but I think in the Kephalia Gnostici, there in chapter 3, there is reference there, but you can probably find other parts of the corpus, particularly in the Greek ascetic writings, it will probably be littered throughout there. So, but I'm not sure, you maybe are referring to a specific text where he does you get more, so to speak, physiological. But anyway, that's just something that came to mind from my memory.
Marvelous. This is also fascinating. And I would like to, if I may, try to wrap up the sort of physical speculation about the angels, because I think that we have other sort of areas to address in the future. But one idea that occurred to me is that perhaps the reason why we don't see the angels in in the way that we try to understand the physical world is that the angels wouldn't come into contact with the physical world in the way that other parts of it would. So for instance, if we were to look at a tree and we could see, for instance, the leaves and the branches and the roots and so on, we couldn't see like the vital principle of the tree, like what gives the tree life. We wouldn't see, for instance, like the DNA of the tree, or we wouldn't see the germination of the tree that comes from another tree. And so the angels, in as far as they are both the original created spirits and also they're at work in the creation of the universe, they aren't, as it were, visible within the products of that creation. And they wouldn't be continuous with it in the same material sense or the extended sense in which material things are. And so we might think of the angels rather as something like the way that the elan vital, the vital force in Henri Bergson was thought of, or maybe in the sense of something like subjectivity, something that, as it were, is always there accompanying the object, but for which is not visible in any objective field. And if that's the case, then perhaps the way we should think about the angels is more in terms of, as it were, their purpose or their self-direction or their inner life, rather than thinking of them as though they have to be something that we can have any sense of, as it were, the demons pressing upon the brain or any physical contact with. And that might leave us something of the anxiety of trying to, as it were, find angels continuous with other material things. And Madison, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to sort of engage with that because there is quite a body of literature that suggests that the angels should, in fact, appear within sense impressions, or at least the consequence of an angel should appear within sense impression. I mean, to go into the operation of judgment in Aquinas and within the tradition of, say, Ran or say even Lonergan, the reality of an encounter with an angel would actually create a measure of impression that should actually occur in the intelligible species within the sort of material operation of the body. So I think it's a little bit premature to sort of say that the idea to pull that out, and I think that would actually tie into one of the general themes that we see in 20th century theology of the fixation on the religious sense, on the sense of the thing that is present, rather than in necessarily direct empirical sense data. So, I mean, there is something more in that place, I think, that could be teased out. And I think it's something we would want to be very hesitant to close the door on.
This might be a good way to connect to questions of poetry and literature that we flagged earlier, but we haven't had a chance to circle around back to. So the notion of the spiritual senses, I'm sure you know, Madison, from your studies on ROR, has its roots in Origin of Alexandria, and the notion that every statement of scripture, as it were, is inspired and also points beyond itself to the whole of the Christian life and the whole final purpose in coming to know God. And so there's more to the meaning of any statement than what it means at its initial significance. It as it were, has an inner spiritual sense that captures the whole mystical economy of the scriptures and what they might mean for our lives. And we might perhaps wonder then if every material indication, every sign is somehow open to the whole, or is inspired by the whole and directed towards, from the beginning to the end, for its creator, then is there a sense in which literature and poetry also is a way of finding a kind of effective, maybe even material sense of the angels at work in the things that we create and the way that we respond to them?
Are you thinking of the idea of angels as sort of muses? Is this?
Yes, very much so.
Well, they have choirs.
Yes, Austin, you have your hand up.
So Tolkien, actually, this is one of the most surprising things that I found when I was researching for my book, Tolkien Dogmatics, was that Tolkien believed that he received quite a bit of inspiration for his work in this way. And that he believed that there was some sort of ministration of angels that was working on his normal authorial processes, and that he received even sometimes particular elvish words through this sort of mind-to-mind contact. And he's got this is why he's so fascinating, is because this line between his personal life and sometimes his literary life gets so thin. In this work called the Notion Club Papers, He has a sort of literary stand-in for himself, talking to the other literary stand-ins for the Inklings, and about how difficult it is sometimes to realize when you've got mind-to-mind contact with a different individual versus when it's just yourself and your own natural processes. And this would go towards your point, Ryan, that the speculative part or the purely intellective part, like how do we discern, how do we distinguish when we have an angelic communication versus when we have just our own thought processes wandering? And Tolkien seems to have hit upon a way and imaginatively portrayed it in that particular work, Notion Club Papers, which I would recommend to you all. But the other person that mentioned in the chat, Madison and I were discussing, is of course C.S. Lewis, who's right there along with Tolkien, and he has a lot to say about mind-to-mind interactions in works like Screwtape Letters, and then also in the Ransom trilogy, the final book of that Hideous Strength. He's got this whole, I mean, the whole plot revolves around the scientific location of these previous, what we would previously have called demons, that he's creating these materialist magicians, he says, that these entities, which we were describing with a different vocabulary in previous ages, we've now reclothed in a more plausible sounding scientific vocabulary, and they too are working upon us in ways that we can't immediately perceive because we're not used to interacting with non-bodily beings.
Fascinating. Yes, I've always thought that, as you mentioned, there's a kind of angelic hierarchy in Tolkien, and that the elves are very much embodied angels. They, as it were, they endure in Arda even after the death of their physical body. And there's this really exciting notion that I think you're referring to, that in works of literature that we connect with, in poetry that resounds with us, and even perhaps when we find someone whom we feel like we share some lasting connection with, that we have some more privileged contact with their mind that doesn't seem to be adequately accounted for by any effective sensation that we can have through our bodies. And I wonder if in the more sort of elevated moments of our mental life, that we feel as though we're receiving ideas like angels almost immediately without, as it were, the continuity of discursive reason. Harry, and I don't know who had their hand up first. I think, Samuel, you had your hand up first.
This is a really interesting question, and the mention of Tolkien and Lewis in this context, I think, are important. But I struggle with this this line because, in my view, it relates to the anthropomorphism of angels, and in a way, we shouldn't let them. I don't think we should let them off the hook. I don't think we should let these beloved authors of ours off the hook so easily. There is a secularization here going on. The use of angels in this way parallels directly to Hölderlin, for instance. You have a very nice book by Guardini, Weltbild und Frömmigkeit, that talks about this. And there, Guardini talks about how in Hölderlin, the angels are these like massive powers and really big creatures that always relate to the history of a town or a city or a fatherland. The biblical elements of prophecy and apocalypse still matter in this case, but the significance of the angels is fully immersed in the immanence of the world. So they're deified heroes of the fatherlands. So this gets into the tutelary deities and opens up a lot of questions. But I struggle with that line, and I wonder your thoughts.
Well, I want to return back to this, if we can, later, the liability both for, as it were, forgetfulness of the angels and an inflation of them, whereby angels come to mean something more malevolent and less open, as it were, to messaging the meaning of the glory of God to us. Something that, as it were, seems like a kind of totalizing engine of power that stands above us. But I hear Arabella has her hand up, so perhaps we can turn, and we'll return back to this later.
Hello. So I simply wanted to mention and point to some potentially quite obvious moments in scripture and in the history of poetry in the English language, where the angels can be seen to be at the origins of the production of human language, human song. So scripturally, it's some of the obvious moments are the angels appearing to the shepherds, but also the words spoken both to Isaiah in the temple and in his vision of the temple and the throne of God, and in the book of Revelation, which then become the source of our liturgical texts, the Trisagion, the Sanctus, and the Gloria, the ancient hymn of the early church. And I've been sort of quite interested as a medievalist, which is what I was actually originally as a literary scholar, in moments, particularly in medieval drama, where this is sort of taken up playfully by the authors, the originators of those texts, to reflect on how indeed song, poetry, lyric might have come from the angels, and the whole possibility of certain forms of output. So specifically, the shepherds, when they leave the angels to go to the Christ child, there are comic dialogues in some of these pieces of religious drama, in which they discuss how they might or how they might not imitate the angelic song, and then we see them. In fact, this might even relate to why a lot of medieval carols are macaronic, why they are both in the Latinate language, the language of the intellect, which is associated with angelic language, and in the vernacular, the language of the shepherds, because somehow they are always already the caroling interplay of the angelic and the human, which is so central to sort of the Christmas mystery. I suppose this is sort of seasonal territory I'm meditating on. But also obviously the very first poem in the English language, Caedmon's hymn glorying the creation, is relayed to him by an angel. And just sort of some sort of things to mention there about the literary and the angelic that I've been thinking about, wondering about. Yes, I think I'll leave it there, but
Thank you, Arabella. That was fascinating. And there's undoubtedly so many sources of intertwining influences and indications of the angelic in literature across the English language and beyond. I'd be happy to learn more as you can. And I think Samuel has a response.
Well, yeah, I mean, this whole topic is really fascinating, and I've always wondered, this is armchair philology, but I've always wondered if there's a connection between, in French you call like someone's genius, le génie, and but this also relates to like spirits and angels, or can also be called génie, and so but it's axiomatic to call like to describe the character of a poet through his genius, and so I always wondered if there was a connection in this way, and I think there is, and people have certainly, different writers have certainly picked up on that, but the Arabella's comments really go back a long way in the early church, and you have and in Judaism you have all these traditions where the angels are responsible for giving the languages to all the nations. This is the whole there's a whole tradition of interpreting the Tower of Babel this way, and divine election is even explained through it, right? You have Israel is the people who chose to stick close to God's own language. So this is a really important topic and fascinating for me.
Harith, I believe you had your hand up first.
Yes, Samuel's point about a genius or genie brought me back to something you said, Ryan, about this is not angels as a trope as they appear in literary works, but the way that angels can be used as a model to account for the way that we follow certain ideas or our choice to pursue certain avenues of thought one way or another. And to me, like, this seems to be like a really fertile ground for showing how there are gaps or opportunities, even in like modern ways of theorizing the way that like literature works, or the way that reading works, or the way that writing works, where we can still yet make appeal to certain maybe intelligible entities that are non-empirical, that are maybe accordingly illogical in terms of like our decision to act, our decision to pursue one person, one body of work, one set of poems, beyond just what we make of them a first surface read, but that the way that they leave an impression on us to say, okay, let's continue following this and let's continue exploring. So yeah, it's exciting for me to hear that be brought up here in this dimension, because that register in relation to specifically the idea of wits in German Romanticism is something that I'm trying to tie together with an interest in angelology as giving a systematic or offering the opportunity for a systematic account for the way that certain desires or behaviors or avoidances work.
Marvelous. Yes, we might imagine that just as there are muses that inspire the work of art, so similarly are there angels that sort of guide the reception and the adulation that we have generation after generation in how we receive and understand that work. Luke, you had your hand up next.
There we go. Yeah, to continue that discussion, we've got 4 kids running around in the background here. It might get noisy. I can't make any promises. There might be blood. It's 4 boys between the ages of 3 and 12. Okay. Well, what's interesting in this discussion is, I think when we look at the idea of sort of, well, what about the angelic muse in a sense? Well, part of what we've been talking about is, adverting to a cosmology in which there is not only room, but a necessary place for the angels. And I don't think any one of us would say that our cognition is not embodied. We recognize, of course, the role of the electrical, so the physical, the chemical, the biological, and then of course we get to our own conceptual realm. We're like, okay, yes, and all these things inhere together in us. But sometimes I think we sort of assume that it stops there, and whatever the angels are doing are maybe over and above or extraneous and imposed from the outside. But is there a way in which we might recognize that our cognition belongs to a world, certainly embodied and so inclusive of everything, let's say on the downside, coming up from the physical, chemical, and biological into the conceptual? Is there also a component above it that is in which we are engaged in that process? But because we're so used to sort of sense perception, we don't recognize our own intellectual perception as already a kind of perception of angelic activity, which we just don't put a name to. Or rather, maybe this is a way for us to say we have to recognize or realize that angelic activity is going to be in a different mode. So, we might, in some sense, perceive it without having a way to perceive it, even though we are already a part of that integration, which is not necessarily a very clear way of saying something, except that when we think about this question of, let's say, genius, is it not sort of the exceptional but normative?
Fascinating. Yes, I imagine that in every generation, people who have had a greater intuition about their intellectual life have been more open to the role of, as it were, unknown powers and forces shaping and directing their thoughts, and also that perhaps that the role of the genius is in romantic idealism and art is yet another way of, as it were, calling upon these unseen forces that, as it were, give life and wings to our imagination and our speculative thought. So, do we have anyone from the audience here who might like to contribute? Could you turn on your microphone?
Yeah, so I think a little bit getting to that point and the way in which angels are already present in everything, and for that reason sort of more invisible. There's a very interesting sermon by Newman called The Powers of Nature, which is all about this topic. And there's one brief quote from that I found here that kind of gives the spirit of it, if I can find it again. So kind of two things here. One, where he says, "I do not pretend to say that we are told in Scripture what matter is, but I affirm that as our souls move our bodies, be our bodies what they may, so there are spiritual intelligences which move those wonderful and vast portions of the natural world which seem to be inanimate. And as the gestures, speech, and expressive countenances of our friends around us enable us to hold intercourse with them, so in the motions of universal nature, in the interchange of day and night, summer and winter, wind and storm, fulfilling his word, we are reminded of the blessed and dutiful angels. And so in a sense, the idea there is that we don't just find the angels in some extraordinary intervention, but it's a different mode of relating to the reality that's already there, that of being able to experience the intersubjectivity in those things, interaction with apparently inanimate nature is the sort of normal mode of interacting with angels according to Newman there. I think he has a quote a little later on where he kind of lambasts the arrogance of scientists who think that just because they have an extremely elaborate and effective descriptive account of nature, that they somehow have exhausted it and can eliminate the subjectivity that's there. That there's actually this is not logically followed. The fact that you can describe it does not imply anything about having eliminated the subjectivity and agency that is behind it according to the Christian tradition.
Well, on that note of the surprising ubiquity of the angels, and I hate to interrupt your moment of thought there, Sam. Well, why don't, Sam, if you could just say something briefly. I was going to call a break, but did you have something you wanted to say quickly?
Well, just a further reflection on tying back to where you introduced this session more broadly. This topic, I think, especially in the 20th century, which it seems to be one of the reasons why angels, if we're gonna call it a decline in simple terms, why theology as such becomes less interested in angels is because I think with the use of dialecticism within theology, you have a very strong tendency to sharply distinguish between what counts as theology and what exists as writing, what counts really as dogma and reflection that continues the speaking of the word, and what counts as allegorical exegesis or poetry or inspirational speech or prophetism. All of those things are naturally charismatically part of the church and the ministry of God. But in terms of what comes to be understood as theology itself, especially dogmatic theology, angelic speech and the speech acts that happen from angels to humans are sharply distinguished between revelatory and logos-centered speech. So I just think that's it's just a note about if we're trying to uncover and get to the bottom of a certain absence of angelology in theological discourse, maybe that plays a role as well.
So perhaps something of the refinement of theological discourse and the claims to rigor have excluded these effective modes of receiving angelic speech that otherwise have been lost. On that note, I wanted to offer us a short break so that anyone who would like to can step away and have a tea or coffee. So it's currently here in Rome, 3:45. Could we take a 5-minute break and come back at 3:50? That's 5 minutes from now. And you can turn off your cameras, but I look forward to having you back and hope to see you soon. Okay, so how long? So 15 minutes, actually. Why don't come back at 4, 15 minutes from now. Okay, and we'll have 1 hour afterwards. Thank you very much. See you soon. Welcome back. I hope you've enjoyed your brief break. And we have 1 more hour now for our discussion. And I thought we might turn to some of the underexplored topics that we had flagged previously. I had hoped that earlier that we would be able to have breakout sessions, but sadly it doesn't seem to be working on Zoom today. So there's a few topics that have been talked about on a number of occasions that we haven't had a chance to explore in depth. One of them that Samuel has mentioned on a few times is the political impact of angelology, whether there's a sense in which perhaps the cause of the disbelief in the angels has a political constitution in the modern era, and also whether there are certain ideas about the angels that we perhaps find inimical to modern politics, or perhaps alternatively, whether there's a new view of the angels that sort of sifts this difference between different political visions. So in one sense, we might say that the angels in Dionysius, for instance, the angelic hierarchy appears to overlap with and give inspiration or perhaps even elevate and authorize a political hierarchy. Hierarchy being a term that was coined by Dionysius, but a term also which is in many ways inimical to the notion of egalitarianism and of the equal rights of man, and for which oftentimes we resist because, as it were, we've erected towering hierarchies of capital and finance that seem to dominate our lives. It seems like in two senses, we've established a more hierarchical society today than in the past, than perhaps at the sort of apex of sort of secular republican movements in the middle 20th century. On the other hand, we seem to be more resistant to this notion than ever before. And I wonder if the angels have a conflicted role to play in this as well. So is there anyone that might like to share a few reflections on this topic and whether there might be both political possibilities or points of resistance to the speculation of the angels today? Luke, you have your hand up. Oh, Luke, you're still muted, please.
Thank you, Ryan. Sorry about that. Yeah, if only to say a few points about hierarchy. I mean, one of the things that I harp on for Dionysius is that what seems to happen in let's say late 12th and early 13th century is the politicization of hierarchy. In terms of the ecclesiastical hierarchy and the celestial hierarchy, those texts really don't have a strong political connotation, and hierarchy is almost exclusively the operation of the sacred work of deification and glorification. It is an act of worship, and hierarchia, of course, is coined off of the back of hierarches, being the cultic leader. And so, yes, there's obviously a kind of authority, but it's an authority of divinization. And insofar as I know the tradition in the Latin West, it only really becomes political once you have the insertion of figures such as kings and various other potentates, or ecclesiastical potentates such as the Pope, that makes it into a political structure. And I think one of the things that I argue in my work is that, and I'm still working on this, is that what has happened in the 12th century or into the 13th century seems to have been, I think that let's say perhaps the Eucharistic controversies around shift the concern with the Eucharist from the power to transform and the authority to transform the sacred species away from the idea of offering. And that sort of brings together a sort of a view of hierarchy, which is downward authority rather than glorification and deification, principally. But once it hits, you get people like Aquinas and Bonaventure bringing earthly political vision into hierarchy, whereas in Dionysius, it really only appears in the discussion of ancient priest kings, which once that's gone, it's only the bishop who is the earthly representation of hierarchia, and that role is sacred teaching as the interpretation of scripture and giving us a vision of the angels and Christ's operation in the angels, and deification. So what I find interesting about the Franciscan take that Bonaventure has is that it's quite radical in identifying Francis as the one who is most hierarchized and the image of the hierarchic man. So in which his lowliness is in fact the image of his seraphicity. At the same time, as you see this emergence of the language of hierarchy embracing politics, but also the application of hierarchy to the church, meaning the bishops, basically, rather than the operation of deification. So I think it's a term that got, in some sense, misunderstood thanks to the 13th century and has given it a bad reputation ever since.
That's an amazingly helpful correction. Thank you very much for pointing all of that out. But I wonder if we might find points at which this bad notion of hierarchy resurfaces, and which also the notion of the angels today becomes a problem. So for instance, in Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, we have a notion of a kind of super being of the sovereign who has a kind of angelic potency that exercises the world, and yet isn't responsive to or answerable to any higher authority. And perhaps the suspicion of hierarchy today is very much like that. We see in for instance, our international corporations or giant federal states, some notion of this Hobbesian Leviathan, and it seems as though it's both transcendent but also dominating of our lives, and perhaps this is the cause for suspicion. I see Austin had his hand up, so I want to give Austin well, I'll give you a chance to respond, Luke. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was only putting my thumbs up.
Oh, okay, good, perfect. Okay, Austin, your turn.
Just a quick question. Has anybody read Matthew Croasman's book, The Emergence of Sin? No. Okay, so he's at Yale, I believe, and he talks about this concept of superorganism, right? So as in the sense that bees or ants are not the constituent organism, they are just more like our cells. That there's this larger organism that emerges on top of these smaller semi-independent organisms. He exegetes Romans, Paul's concept of sin as a power in Romans, and brings in Walter Wink and some of these other things to talk about the angels of the nations. I don't know if he uses the term angel, but these Prince of Persia, that sort of thing, that there is perhaps a superorganism that is a force that has authority over particular nations or groups of people. It's not something that I've seen referenced to quite a lot of these conversations, but I think it's an intriguing way of approaching this topic. I mean, that's my question in terms of the political, is in what sense, when we read these passages like Daniel or other places, is there a Prince of Persia, or in what sense are Michael or Gabriel associated with Israel? I mean, we see there is some political connection to angels. I think it was Samuel or somebody else that talks about the angels of the nations. What does that mean exactly? And we have to make sure that we're giving the biblical authors priority in terms of leading us in these concepts, and not trying to insert our own ideas of modern Western liberal democracy over against these texts. So we have to let the biblical authors direct us in this regard. So I wonder what people have to respond to that, or if they can direct me.
Sammy, would you like to offer a response?
Sure. The way I see it is that the angels of the nations are a function of the discipline of the theology of history. So when we meet the angel of Persia and the angel of the Greeks, I think, also in Daniel, and I think there's a funny mention in the book of Acts of an angel of Macedonia, this kind of thing. They are instruments and part of God's providence in the world, and this is one of the main lines that the early church takes up, and so it's a way of explaining the development of history in different phases. The idea of conflict that reaches a destination, this kind of thing. So that's one way to go with it. But the other more intriguing possibility that authors pick up in all eras, really, but mainly in modernity, is the possibility that the angel stands for the absolutization of the nation. This is why you get the association of demonic power and nationalism as a force of demonology and this kind of thing. So those are kind of some of the main lines. But it's heavily debated in New Testament scholarship, because the question whether Paul's powers and authorities refer to the nation angels was a major topic in the 20th century, and these New Testament scholars really tried to intervene in political debates, whether interpreting it this way could contribute to the conversation of the legitimacy of the Weimar Republic versus the legitimacy of the New Reich. So it does get thrown around, as you suggest, Austin, people are interpreting it in their political context. But in terms of biblically, what is the function? I think it's for what we could call a theology of history. But that also has political implications as well.
Marvelous. Now, Keegan, I believe we had talked at some time in the past about the contemporary political theoretical interest in angels, specifically in Giulio Agamben and others who are interested in finding a metaphor, perhaps, maybe a one that is more allegorical than real, of the way in which we can imagine angels as the agencies that animate our hierarchical structures or our administrative states. And do you see some opening in contemporary theory to bringing back an idea of angels into how we organize our society and how we live within it?
I don't have any kind of sophisticated perspectives on this, but it does seem to me that in terms of broadly speaking, within the that there is a bit more in terms of openness. I mean, if we, as you mentioned, Agamben as well, talking about these things. If you see, he's got a text on angels, but also in his the kingdom and the glory, also the way that he understands, I could say the preeminence of economy, how economy kind of the divine economy becomes economization is a kind of a outgrowth of divine economy, and how in that perspective angels also become in some ways secularized as kind of to some degree as functionaries within this kind of broadly economization. I think where we've talked about before is, if I remember our previous discussion, this as well, is how the place of angels, but also as how angelology or angels can function within a how they actually exist, how they can exist within even a purely kind of atheistic universe or kind of agnostic universe, and I think how some of that imagery has been retained, and and I think it touches also on some of that the dark side of angelology, which has also been mentioned in the discussion up to now. If we think of the figure of the these like in the like in some of the stories or of Kafka, like these intermediaries which are kind of inscrutable to that are happening behind the scenes within human kind of endeavors, and this inscrutability obviously placing us in kind of situations of existential paranoia and so on. And I think you've also kind of commented more on that, Ryan, in other contexts as well. So I think in those previous discussions, which I mentioned, is that that angelology can very much, I think, it's even within a quote unquote, and I think this is the interesting thing is that in terms of how we frame the categories of enchantment and re-enchantment and disenchantment and secularity, post-secularity, all these things are, a lot of these categorizations really do, and dualisms and bifurcations, when pressed under analytical scrutiny, end up being a lot more harder to pass and to fix into kind of, I think we should see these partly, at least as part of, discursive figurations and of how the language of secularity, languages of whether it's secular angelology or related matters, they're doing specific work and they do specific things within specific contexts, and so I think there is a kind of return we can see within within philosophy. Michel Serres is another one, you know, in terms of media theory and so on. And we can see elsewhere. So I think it does complicate our image of what of secularity is. But yeah, we need to be attentive specifically to the way that these discourses are used. And if we're talking about now the context of nationalism, and you know, the angels of nations, and so we need to particularize where this discourses arise. Where does the 19th century, post the Napoleonic Wars and so on, and how national identities and national context, national museums, the recovery of national antiquities and so on, all this revival of nation and ideas, nation state, idea of the nation, of ethnic identity, ethnic nationalisms, these arise within specific political contexts. And so yeah, I don't have any kind of fully kind of coherent thoughts, but I do think we need to be aware that when angelology is invoked, it's obviously doing the way it's being used within a particular discursive or political configuration, that we need to be attentive to the way it's being used, and some might be more nefarious, or all depending on kind of the way that it's being appropriated and deployed. But yeah, I don't have any kind of systematic thoughts on this matter.
Well, thank you very much for sharing all those reflections. It's very provocative. And I thought we might return to something Shannon Guthrie had said previously. That is, it's often easier to apprehend, or you might say, have a sense of anxiety before the demonic than the angelic. And perhaps studying the demons might be a more accessible way for us, or perhaps most people, to come to think about the angels. And perhaps they'll tell us something about the angels as well as about metaphysics in general. So Shannon, could you tell us a few things about perhaps why it is that the demonic is so perhaps more profound and accessible? I'm thinking, for instance, of how we seem to be have a perpetual fear of sort of inflated ideas, whether it be of the nation state or even of what we can know about the world and what mastery it gives us. And perhaps we want to find a way of marginalizing or controlling or quarantining that. So is there some more pregnant site of focusing upon the discovery of the demonic in the world, and are there lasting legacies of that we should be aware of?
Well, I was trying to think about this idea of its interrelation with politics, and I'm not sure how to cash that out. I know that there have been a lot of discussions about what Clinton Arnold refers to as empire spirits, and it's the idea that demons in some sense are, it's sort of coming on the heels of the suggestion, the theological suggestion that angels are in some sense kind of like patron deities of a sort, nationalistic, I don't know, we want to say that their intelligences behind the various nations, something to do with Deuteronomy 32 about the idea that God has somehow allocated the nations or angels to all the nations, excuse me. But yeah, I'm not sure about the interplay of exploring demonology with respect to trying to understand, how angelology might have a role, or might influence our perceptions of politics. But and gosh, I had something in mind too that I was going to bring out in this regard.
Oh, yes, please do.
But yeah, I was just thinking about, there's a sense in which this is tied, I think, to some sense to trying to understand sort of the teleology of angels themselves. Like, why were they created? And what are their various roles? And it seems like there's no specific or singular role that they do. They worship God in Isaiah 6. They actually dispense and propagate the gospel or messages from God in general. I think it's in Revelation that he might actually dispense the gospel. They come and pronounce acts of they'll pronounce or participate in acts of judgment and that sort of thing. So it's kind of hard to be very precise about what the angels are supposed to be doing, and then how would that role intersect with the state, with the polis, what might be corresponding to that. difficult to say. It just seems like when there's the invoking of the suggestion of a demonic presence, oh, Babylon, Satan is your throne, that's meant to suggest that, okay, so this center of power is more nefarious or significant than the earthly forces or powers that we visibly see in operation. And sort of the invocation of, or the suggestion that angels might be behind something might be to impress sort of the major significance, divine significance, if you will, of whatever is going on. So beyond that, not knowing exactly how to designate angels, how they would correspond in, considering them as some sort of template in a political motif, I would be hard pressed to try to figure out what the connection would be. But of course, it has been ample opportunity for exploitation. Hey, we're on the side of the angels. You guys over there are on the side of the demons. And so our battle is more cosmic than what's going on in the earth. And of course, that could be utilized to justify all sorts of unfortunate things.
Does seem to be both the promise and the peril of raising the topic of angels and demons in a political context. And I see Samuel has something to say in response to this.
Well, it affects one route to thinking about this, I would suggest, is that political theology lends credence to the Gnostic myth, in the sense that the Gnostic attack on worldly power, right? In the Gnostic interpretation, the intermediary agents are the demiurgic forces of the universe that govern everything in it, and they're bad. They're sinful. Only the God who is the king, who doesn't, so God then becomes king and not governor. Right, there's that bifurcation that Peterson and Schmidt debate about so much. The king reigns, but he doesn't govern. So that's kind of one of the main inroads for how to apply the demonic template to political theology.
Fascinating. One topic that came up previously, and I thought we might touch on briefly, and I hope at the end to rise up to both a more metaphysical and perhaps systematic perspective. But before we get there, one topic that came up previously was the role of angels in technology, and specifically in computers or cybernetic systems. And it occurred to me that one way of thinking about politics is to think about, as it were, how human associations and societies are organized through technical modes of administration. And one of those today, of course, is the administration of the distribution and the surveillance of the expenditure of wealth or capital and its various modes of consumption and exchange. That is, if the largest cybernetic entity today is our global financial system, and if that, as it were, is an exchanging of symbolic value, as a way of erecting symbolic values, a way of privileging some and drawing us towards other, then it seems as though we're in a richly symbolic universe, in one in which that is intimately intertwined with our technical systems. I've written a paper previously titled Sacramental Engines, which is about the role of the sacraments in computers, where I argue that there's a role for spiritual intelligences in the central processing unit of computers, and that they wouldn't work unless, as it were, they were emulating something like angelic intelligence. But I wonder also if we have a much more pervasive notion of angelic forces, or you might say invisible agency, in our world today than ever before. So a good example of this is the notion of the algorithm that seems to sort of shape how we receive and communicate through social media, or the way in which people want to, as it were, elevate themselves symbolically through Instagram photos. So does anyone have any thoughts to share about the sort of new role of technology in opening up spaces for angelic contact? Bobby.
Yes, I'd be very interested to see if people have other bibliography or things related to this, because there's a lot of ideas in this space that just have occurred to me and very reading other unrelated things, but I don't have a basis. I wish to flesh this all out. But I think one place to get started thinking about all of this is in some of the Neoplatonic angelologies, where you have an angel associated with each species or genus. So there's a sense in which you're kind of a realist about universals in this very concrete sense, in which there's actually a spiritual intelligence that is responsible for each universal. And that one way of cashing that out is as a way of taking seriously the reality of wholes that are composed of parts that are also real. Because we have this tendency in modern cosmology to try to have this monism where there's just one level of real things, which are the atoms or their matter, and everything else is somehow an epiphenomenon of that. But if you want to have a metaphysics that takes seriously real entities at many levels, so that yes, the atoms are real, but also you have organisms, you have societies, and each one has its own metaphysical consistency, that then raises the problem of how to understand the teleology, the directedness, the intelligibility of each of these levels. And so in that sense, you could cash out the angels of the nations as, in a sense, taking the nation seriously, taking a social unit as something that really exists, and that the direction it takes, the way that it evolves, its overall character is not just an accidental result of the decisions that the people in it happen to make, but that there is actually a spiritual intelligence that could be at work there. So you have some picture kind of along those lines. Then that raises the question of when you now artificially produce something that at the beginning doesn't have any kind of unity. So because I would take it that when you build a computer or something, at the beginning, what appears there is really an epiphenomenon of the parts. You artificially put these parts together, but there is no real entity that's there aside from an extension of your imposing order on these parts. But it's the kind of thing that's susceptible of behaving as a unit. And it's possible for the human to actually abdicate his agency and his responsibility over the thing and let it behave autonomously. And now once the thing's behaving autonomously, now what is it? Now it's not just necessarily, maybe it continues being the epiphenomenon of the components, but it sort of raises this possibility of, okay, what is there a way of talking about the agency that's at work, what we colloquially refer to as the algorithm or the machine or whatever this sort of collective sort of phenomenon is of the whole technological system? Is it just a metaphor to use these names to attribute some kind of agency to the whole collective? Or is there some kind of way of taking that seriously as a possibility of we're interacting with a different intelligence?
It's very helpful. I take it that the descent from the genera to the species that we find in the Neoplatonic hierarchies, I think Seamus O'Neill had referred to this previously, extends also not just, as it were, eternally through the eternal ideas, but also historically through the way in which, as it were, human communities, even though they are constructed, nonetheless, they can gather together and assume a different character unto themselves through their mutual association and the purposes they assume. And so we might say, for instance, the Tower of Babel is a point at which, as it were, the tower falling from heaven almost breaks this link between, or this descent from, as it were, the eternal ideas to the historical manifestation of spirits in time. And that's also a helpful way, perhaps, of thinking about artificial forms of cognition or even of what appears to be a kind of relative autonomy unto machines, in contradistinction to a natural unity and self-organization that we observe in the generation of animals and humans. So obviously machines aren't born the same way that humans are born, but nonetheless they exhibit a relative degree of autonomy on the basis of their internal organization and the purposes that are directed according to their design. So with that said, I think, Austin, did you want to talk about the great question of whether we have a more sort of profound awareness on the basis of sort of extraordinary sites of extraterrestrial phenomena?
Well, actually, I wanted to talk about the angels in technology there briefly, because you mentioned some books that might be helpful. Kevin Kelly, he was a
Austin, I think you might have lost your audio connection.
Hello.
Okay, we can hear you now.
Sorry. There's a book called What Technology Wants by Kevin Kelly, and he posits a sort of emergent mind that this technological sphere is creating. I mean, he's not writing from any sort of theological stance. It might be interesting to come at that laterally from what he's saying, that there's an epiphenomenal mind in the technosphere. And then I also think, I mean, I'm not Catholic, but what do we all think about Teilhard de Chardin? Is it time to recover his ideas of the noosphere and these sorts of things, this emergent technological or intellectual realm of cognition? I don't know, just a few brief things. And then in the literary side, there's I believe he's a Catholic novelist, R.A. Lafferty, has a book called Past Masters. And I mean, he wrote it back in the 60s or 70s, but part of the plot of that is that they create these AIs, and the AIs are, of course, technological. They're philosophical zombies, right? They don't have a consciousness, but they appear to have consciousness, and so that's how the demonic forces of this particular planet are able to inhabit and direct the political forces of that civilization. So I think that the conversation around AI and transhumanism in particular might have some really interesting parallels with the conversation around angelic intelligences, as you say. So that's a field that is going to be increasingly important as we move into the coming years, and that might be a field where angelologists and demonologists actually end up having a lot to say, as you mentioned, in terms of what constitutes a consciousness.
Yes, we were discussing this over lunch, and I think this maybe one of the emerging fields of exploration for the study of the angels today. One of the ways in which I think it comes into contact is this: if the nation angels come to being within history, and they do so through technological means, in the case of the Tower of Babel, with the fall of Babel and the creation of new cities, then it stands to reason that our technological constructions are also a way of, as it were, assembling new social organizations, and through that also new spirits that emerge within those social units. We might also say that new technology, whether it be social media platforms or whether it be new user interfaces, admit of new ways of interacting with machines and of spreading that interaction at light speed across the globe in a way that seems spiritual and perhaps even angelic. And so I suspect that, yes, this question will become more and more paramount. Perhaps as our social organizations and ways of contact seem less material and more evanescent, it might invite more angelological speculation. I see, Samuel, you have your hand up.
Well, yeah, I think the internet's a really important parallel because Michel Serres, he has a book called La Légende des Anges, and he talks about exactly this. I think he was writing kind of in the days of the emergence of the internet, but he points out that this is an angelic phenomenon because our universe is organized around message-bearing systems. Complex and sophisticated, they bear in themselves relationships and packets of information, and that's how our bodies work. That's how we work at the cellular level. That's how the universe works, and so there's a lot of analogical work to be done there.
Definitely, yes. So at this point, the study of the angels becomes something that is porously open to within information studies or within technical studies and perhaps even cybernetics. And so we can see, I hope, that quite a lot of emergent fields are perhaps looking backwards and forward to what we as theologians could say about the angels. I see, Luke, you're vigorously nodding. Did you have something you'd like to share?
Well, I mean, I'm thinking about all of these aspects. It's very interesting to see how they're coming together. As we were talking about the angels as muse not too long ago, and here we are on the other side. What is the angelic role, or is there something analogously angelic, actually angelic, or at least non-biologically conscious? In the internet, is it in some way that human action, or rather, in what way does human action as a means of, let's say, mediating angelic action, play into the role of the generation of these other kinds of being that are then also another sort of ground or locus in which we can talk about angelic action? So that was an interesting one, just thinking about that. But also how this conversation comes alongside actually the UFO topic, which I know it seems like some people are itching to get towards, because of course there's the discussion of the sort of the extraterrestrial presence. What does that mean? But it also, as I followed ufology over the past year, ever since the February shootdowns in northern Canada and the US, about just how many people who become involved in that field switch from an interest in, let's say, the appearance of extraterrestrial to the UFO as hyperobject or as something hyperdimensional, which brings us to a more of a discussion of what are these other modes of being that we are exploring? Not just, okay, what's this other thing? And that is simply immaterial, but rather, how many other modes of conscious being can we talk about when we get to plurality? So that's why I'm sort of nodding my head as these ideas are bouncing around inside it. So I'll stop talking and let other people take the reins.
It's a hugely important topic, and it's one that deserves more credulity and interest from the scientific community and from scholars at large. And just briefly, I'll say two things about it. One is that we have sufficient, I think, mechanical material evidence for UFO sightings and of extraordinary varieties. And the most pregnant one is the Nimitz occasion, when multiple machine-based radars were able to track objects moving at over Mach 10 and right angles and many other things. And I encourage anyone to look into this. But what comes from this, I think, is that we are facing a moment now where we are able to find things within the world for which we have sufficient evidence, but for which we cannot fully explain. And it gestures back to something like a Middle Platonic moment where, for instance, in Plutarch, he says that the proper place of the angels is in above the sublunary sphere, that is in the fiery heavens. That is, it points us to a realm of action that isn't accessible to us in our terrestrial life, and also to a notion of the transcendent that we can't fully explain, and for which our imagination can run wild. And as you say, many UFO research, they quickly jettison the extraterrestrial hypothesis of the origin of UFO phenomena in favor of thinking about whether there might be, as it were, future humans, or whether these might be gods or angels. And so I think that this is a point at which sociologists, religious scholars have an interest in the angelic, and I think the systematic theologians have to be prepared to respond.
Yeah, I would say definitely in terms of response, because what I've been following is there is a almost cult-like characteristic to many of these, to many people, interaction with ufology, and it moves very quickly from the nuts and bolts extraterrestrial hypothesis, which isn't always jettisoned, but sometimes is jettisoned, but or just taken as like just the sort of the least interesting part of something that's a much larger phenomenon. But it's also something that, for instance, I'm always telling my parish priest, hey, you should be thinking about this because this issue is going to talk up. He's like, oh, okay, Luke, yeah, that's interesting. You're the parish theologian. Nice job. But I don't think there are enough people who realize just how serious this could be, especially on the political end of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Madison, I see you have your hand up.
So I sort of want to push on just before we run out of time, or before people start leaving, to the metaphysical and the cognitive implications of this sort of thing. I mean, I mentioned in the chat earlier when Brian, I think it was talking about the psychological and the rescission in which takes place when psychology becomes a dominant discipline. And one of the things that really strikes me is that the very early arguments around the birth of psychology include the attempt to assert the reality of ideas, and that the reality of ideas is connected to the idea, connected to a concept of the idea as being possessed of life, being possessed of action, and possessed, therefore, of self-affirmation and independent exigency as a separate intelligence. This actually turns, you have several thinkers at the time who directly associates this with the Platonic res aeterniae, and you have these given as being a basic element of Thomistic cognition and Thomistic psychology, particularly with respect to the conversio ad phantasmata. The question for me really becomes then, because this is sort of the guts of my research, and this is why I sort of push on this area, is what does it mean if we're going to try and speak into the space, speak into the overall the priority towards the skeptical that the modern psychological apparatus has pushed upon all inquiry into thought, which is it seems as if the problem itself is within the idea of the idea, with how we're actually conceiving of the things that flow in our minds as we're trying to construct our concept of reality. Whereas with an older variation, with this sort of variation that lost the argument back in the first 10 years of the 20th century, you could actually argue that angels are intrinsic to our psychological function as healthy human beings. because of the way in which they carry forth the essence of the thing in itself, the essence of the noumena. Each individual noumenon would correspond to an individual angel. And these sorts of ideas and what that actually means in our assumptions, our suppositions, our imaginations, our entire ability to build the tapestry of our creation. So that's sort of what I wanted to just try and bring some attention to, because I think there are some very dangerous implications in simply conceding the psychological and the phenomenal to the skepticism that's so rampant today. And this is where I think thinkers who engage in practical theology, such as Luigi Giussani and the idea of the religious sense, can actually be tied in to this project of recovery of a creation that is naturally braced, which was required if we're going to talk about the necessity of the angels for the ability for all cognitive and psychological function. So.
Fascinating. It recalls the daemon of Socrates that he refers to in the Apology, and also the notion of the instruction of the angels that we find straight from Origin of Alexandria to Duns Scotus, and the discernment of spirits even in Ignatius Loyola. So I think there's a lot to learn and explore here. Now, I want to, if we could, shift to a more general reflection on and concluding remarks on the topic of angelology. So we have only 20 minutes now, and what I'd like to offer is everyone, if they would like, a platform to share some concluding reflections on what you've thought about today, or what you think is worthwhile to explore as we move forward, and also what the emerging and important ideas ought to be in the future for the study of the angels. So I'd like to start, if I could, with people here in the audience, and then we'll move back to the online guests. So Giulio, no? Okay. Philip, would you like to share a few thoughts?
Sure. I'll say, first of all, that I've been illuminated by the conversation today. I find one of the things I'm glad to see is that there are so many people who are seriously thinking about angelology, and but doing so from so many different perspectives, that there are a number of contemporary topoi, it seems, that have arisen in everyone's independent research. So from what I can tell, we've got this the question, for example, of the mode of angelic existence. You've got the difference, the possibility of angelic bodies versus the idea of a completely disembodied spirit. We've got questions of political theology, political angelology. We've got the relation to technology, artificial intelligence, AI as angelic intelligence as much as it is artificial intelligence. And then the literary connection. And it just seems to me that one of the aims you had, Ryan, was potentially leading to a conference and then perhaps an edited volume, that it seems like there is enough interest, or there are enough scholars interested in these variety of topics to make a proposal that would be quite interesting to a broad base of scholars, and then ultimately to a press. So I think from that perspective, I'm quite pleased to see what's coalesced today.
I feel like I always have something to say, but the experts will have better things, but maybe just a word of pastoral advice or counsel. Just the idea of, on the ground, again, the idea of the battle. And we haven't mentioned it, but just the fact that, and I know that not everyone's Catholic or Christian, perhaps, and so I don't mean to assume that, but just the idea of the topic itself lends itself to sort of stirring things up. So I just want to mention that because we haven't mentioned it. So one way that I describe this is when I was a little boy, I would go up to my brother and I would say, "I'm not touching you, I'm not touching," and I would like put my fingers really close to his face, trying to elicit a reaction from him, trying to get some energy from him. And the more he relaxed and trusted, the first thing I would do is manifest. And I use that word technically, I would get worse. It'd be my last ditch effort to get something from him. And then when he would just keep ignoring me, eventually I would have to go because he's not giving me anything to feed on, any obsession, energy, fear, anything of that genre. And so I just wanted to that's why, our Blessed Mother, I think about Mary and her gentleness. That's how she steps on the snake, is in her total trust, her total faith. Evil spirits know they're not getting anything from her, and so at her name they run. So just a word of pastoral advice from someone who's not an expert, but who has been involved in deliverance ministry, to just remember that the topic itself lends itself to stirring things up, and just want to offer that word of warning.
Very much, Father Brian. Bobby, would you like to share something?
Yeah, I think that one aspect that came up for me, actually, even from the first introduction, and I forget who mentioned this. I think it may have been Madison on the fragmentation of theology, and how one aim of a conference like this could also be to try to give some points to some way forward for how to reincorporate the teaching on angels in a more robust way in the theology curriculum in the university and seminaries, because it is, as many of these quotes and that Ryan brought up in his initial paper, it is something that has an extremely important role in the whole structure of the Christian tradition. And if you don't pay attention to that, then you can end up with a structure that doesn't fit together, and that it's harder to actually transmit the tradition and its integrity if it's missing this piece. And we see that there's actually a wide variety of ways to talk about this in a way that's compelling and that is sort of makes sense to the current audience and to the concerns that the people have now. So I think that the whole interdisciplinary aspect could potentially even help with that sort of process of having a more robust engagement with this theme and not treating it as marginal and even in the theology curriculum.
Yes, of course. That is, if we expand more widely, we can draw together things more easily, and perhaps also point back to how the angels are ever present and also opened up from within every discipline. Brilliant. So I'd like now to move to offer the chance for all of our online guests to offer any concluding reflections. And I recognize that not everyone may wish to. So it'd be helpful perhaps if if you would kindly indicate with your hand up whether you might like to give a few concluding remarks. And you're certainly welcome to. Keegan.
Just to say that maybe just in terms of going forward, however, whatever form this continuing conversation takes, how the form it takes eventually, I think it might be worthwhile, because it hasn't really come up. It's been there in the background, but maybe in terms of as a kind of implicit, unthematic kind of mode of reflection, but. On the very kind of the adjective to the theme of this workshop, namely the speculative itself, because it's not entirely always obvious in terms of how this language is being used. I know the way that you've kind of adopting it in terms of a as a kind of a mode of reflection from a priori principles or a mode of kind of metaphysical reasoning, which is excessive of the empirical or the logically empiricist. So it might be just worth as we go, as this continues on, to actually be more intentional and thematic in terms of this nature of the speculative itself, and so that's something that I would recommend, going forward, because it seems like in the discussion itself that we, even though we are kind of engaging with implicitly speculative matters, we haven't, as we see within the discussion of UFOs, fully left behind the question of empirical phenomena. So in terms of thinking reflectively on exactly this interaction between how to bring together or to to think more holistically regarding questions of perception, the empirical, but also the speculative. And I think that might be something worth to consider in discussions going forward. So that's just kind of my one thought at this stage.
Thank you, Keegan. Just as a brief note, the notion of speculative, the word speculativa, I believe, occurs in medieval Latin philosophy, but it refers back to a notion that you already find in Plato of a kind of noetic vision. For instance, in Plato's Republic, I think 408, you have this noetic vision of the good that shines like the sun. And also the ideas are the root, Indo-European root for the ideas. That is a way of showing what we know. And the notion of speculative here is meant to point to how knowledge ultimately is something that is able to grasp that of which it knows is true without standing upon any contingent reference to the world of our experience. Now, it doesn't mean to say that we dispense with the world of our experience, but rather that what we experience becomes more richly understood through the knowledge that we have of it, and that we then, as it were, find our understanding manifest in those things of our sight. UFOs are really curious counterexample to this because they seem to sort of invert it. That is, on the one hand, we observe it, but we don't know where it comes from, and we, as it were, see the transcendent in as far as the origin of those objects seem inexplicable to us. So I think there's a number of ways we talk about the speculative, but I hope it's helpful in regards that it doesn't, as it were, anchor the discussion of angelology in genealogy, history, or in personal testimony, that being a way of pointing to its philosophical aspirations. Seamus, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, yeah, thank you for this. I think this was a great session. I think, if angels and demons, if they exist, maybe even if they don't, there's not a more interesting or probably important question to be engaging in for us. I found this really helpful. I wonder not to expand too much, but I know from my own experience in the last 10 years or so in researching these kinds of questions that I wonder the question of angelology and demonology really go hand in hand. Most of the things I've tried to figure out or learned about demons really come within the context of angels as well. And I suspect the reverse is probably true. We understand something about the one from the other, given their origin. So I wonder about just how such future work is done or pitched or talked about, whether that's expanding too much or whether that might be something to name as you go forward. I found a lot of this helpful, even with the question of the comment that Father just made about, as a Catholic too, I always worry about curiositas when looking into these questions, when we believe in these things. And, they say there's two attitudes to have about the demons, two unhealthy attitudes, and one is to ignore them or disbelieve in them altogether. And the other one is to be probably too much interested or curious. So I always wonder where that line is and wondering the end to which we make these inquiries. And having in mind what the purpose is. I found the point about psychology really helpful in terms of as a way this is talked about in my own sort of delving into this. I was fascinated by how the DSM-5 actually talks about demon possession and these kinds of things in ways that I would not have expected it to talk about anymore, but nevertheless, there it is. So I thought this was great. I wonder if people are happy or comfortable with it, a list of participants' names and contacts. So there's some people I'd love to follow up with here. Maybe we'll be doing that, but that might be nice as a first step if people are cool with that, like names and contact lists. Certainly a conference or some kind of ongoing working group or working groups online. I'd be happy to take part in that. It's nice to kind of see faces and names and hear from people who are working on these questions from all over. The literary things for me were fascinating and new, political, the technological, as opposed to just sort of the metaphysical and philosophical, theological, which I'm used to. So this is great. It's a breath of fresh air in a department that's very secular and not open always to these kinds of things. It's nice to find your people sometimes. So I appreciate that. And I'm happy to take part in anything else moving forward. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Seamus. And yes, I think one of the hopefully very exciting aspects of this is that it brings together people who otherwise may never have found anyone to speak for at length or with any expertise about the angels. So I hope this will be mutually inspiring for all of us. And if anyone would like, you can certainly share your contact details in the chat, and I will circulate an email afterwards inviting people to share their emails as well. And I don't know yet, but I may be able to share the video of this session with all of you later today. Or later this week. And I think, Luke, you had your hand up next.
just a very quick reflection on what I've seen today, which is that it seems that when we look to angels as integrators, or looking at the integrative function of angels across disciplines, we also, or across the various spheres, the cosmological, the metaphysical, the literary, etc., it really helps us integrate our own disciplines. And so it seems to me that thinking of angels as integrators helps us work towards the kind of integration that we're wanting to see. So I think that's a lovely theme to come out.
I should hope so, yes. I mean, as we found, there's room for speculation about the angels in fields as diverse as poetry, literature study, biology, astrophysics, politics, almost anything you could think of. And one of the reasons I want to gather other people's thoughts together is because I found that whenever I talk about any specific subject, I always wanted to draw back to this more general question about the mediating relation between heaven and earth and the spiritual intelligences that have a role to play in that. That is, I want to talk about the angels in all things. And so I feel like unless we can gather all people together, or at least a good representative group of scholars, then we can't really begin to talk credibly about the angels today. And for that, I'm very grateful for your contributions. So Shandon, you have your hand up.
Yes, just real quick in the interest of time, I see that we're wrapping up here. I was just going to say that, of course, what we're doing here is glorious in the sense that not as a study in its own right, but also that it does give us further insight into who God is. So it's sort of, there's something very worshipful in scholars coming together and talking about this subject and appreciating, by extension, God's creation. And I love the fact that there's sort of a concerted effort here that we are continuing to go run aground against the prevalence of naturalism. But make no mistake, I do think that, because I don't believe naturalists see us coming, so I do think that there's going to be a sense in which there will be some interesting responses. And just trying to get ahead of the game here, I'm thinking in terms of recent trends toward like Philip Goff's panpsychism. A lot of the stuff that we've talked about, especially in technology, I could see alternative explanations coming to the foray about, if we're finding agency in this or that, mechanism and what have you, there could be, I can anticipate naturalistic responses along the lines of this sort of panpsychism and such. So it's exciting to see this happen, and I look forward to further engagements with everyone here.
Brilliant. Thank you for your contributions. And I can imagine plenty of open avenues that we've explored today, and perhaps we will follow through in the future. Harith, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, just the briefest of thanks, but like no less heartfelt thanks to everyone here and you, Ryan, for organising. I'm really confident that I can leave this session hopefully with a real enthusiasm for this topic, and especially how it can help me answer questions that I'm encountering in semiotic theory with new ways of conceiving mediation and relationality. So yeah, thanks so much. It's been a real joy to join.
Well, it's a joy to see you again, and I hope, yes, you'll carry the torch of our explorations forward and your explorations of all these ideas at Harvard and beyond. Shandon, did you have a follow-up on that?
My apologies, I was just typing. What was the last comment there?
Oh, I see you have your hand raised. I thought you had a response.
It might be a residual. I'm appearing disembodied here, so it's not mine, I assure you.
That's fine. Okay, does anyone else have any concluding reflections? If not, okay, well, I'm so grateful for everyone's contributions today. When I came to Rome, I asked myself, what can I do with this fabulous opportunity that I've been given? And I wanted to gather people together. I wanted to learn from the theologians here in Rome, because I told myself there's never going to be a place in my life where I'm going to find a greater concentration of scholars. But I also recognize that Rome is an international place. It's a place of pilgrimage. And this conference is in a way a pilgrimage of people who share similar hopes and aspirations to know about the angels and to find a way through learning about the angels to the heights of systematic theology. And I feel that with all of our contributions today, with all that we've said, that we found a new way of talking about, entering into, and exploring the message of the angels across different disciplines and across different perspectives and realms of expertise. And I'm immensely grateful for everything you've had to offer, and I hope that this conversation will continue in the future. I hope someday, although I don't yet have any definite plans for it, to find funding and a host for another conference on this subject. And I'm looking forward to having a physical venue to invite all of you to at some point in the future. And should that come together, I look forward also to gathering up written reflections on this topic. So we might look forward to, if everything comes together and the stars align, perhaps the angels bless us, that we will yet see a more sort of effective manifestations of angelic power coming through, whether it be in a conference or in a book. And I hope that you'll keep track of what we have to share on Twitter and beyond, and also keep in touch. So look forward to seeing this, and perhaps this video will be shared in the future. And thank you all for coming, and have a blessed day, and carry along with you the blessings and spirit of the angels.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you for organizing.
Yes, thank you very much. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas from Rome. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Ryan. Cheers.